The great hall of Darkholm fell silent the moment Ragnar Halvson raised his cup. 200 witnesses, 6 clan representatives, every candle burning. And at the low end of that same hall, a young woman in a dark blue dress sat perfectly still. The same woman who had pulled him from a frozen forest floor, who had cleaned his wound with her own hands, who had kept his cloak folded on her bed for 8 weeks without sending it back. The king's voice carried clean across the stone and the firelight. He spoke the name of another woman. He gave his heart to another woman, in front of everyone. And she did not make a sound. So why, 3 days later, did he ride through a February blizzard to find her? And what had she done that made a king willing to burn everything he had just built? Watch until the end. Tell me in the comments, did he deserve her forgiveness? The forest did not warn her. One moment, the birch trees stood ordinary and pale, their white bark glowing like bones in the last amber hour of afternoon light. The next, a body crashed through the underbrush, not 10 yards from where Seraphine knelt gathering yarrow, scattering frost-heavy branches and sending a flock of thrushes screaming into the gray October sky. She did not scream. She had lived alone in this forest for 4 winters, and had learned that screaming changed nothing. She rose slowly, her basket of herbs balanced against one hip, and looked. He was large. That was the first thing she registered. Not in the way of well-fed lords who grew wide at the waist, but in the way of old oak trees, built for endurance, roots sunk deep. He lay face down in the frost-silvered moss, one arm extended as though reaching for something he had dropped, dark hair fanning across the pale ground. His cloak, finer than anything that had ever entered her cottage, deep charcoal wool trimmed with wolf-gray fur, was torn at the shoulder. The tear was not from falling, it was from an arrow. Seraphine set her basket down and crouched beside him. With practiced fingers, she pressed 2 knuckles to the side of his throat and counted. Alive. Barely. The pulse beneath her fingers moved like a candle flame in wind. She turned him over. Later, when she tried to describe what she saw to herself, alone in her own head, honest as she always was in the dark, she could not explain why looking at his face made something in her chest pull tight, the way overstretched cloth pulls just before it tears. He was young, younger than she'd expected given the mass of him. The sharp angle of his jaw was shadowed with several days of dark growth. His lashes, impossibly thick for a man of such obvious hardness, lay still against the stark cut of his cheekbone. His eyes were closed. She looked at the arrow wound. It had gone deep, but missed the lung. She knew wounds the way some women knew embroidery patterns, intimately and without joy. He would not die of this, not tonight. She stood, looked down the length of him, and said to the empty forest, "You are going to be an enormous inconvenience." Then she bent, took his arms, and began to drag. He was heavier than a grown stag. By the time she had pulled, rolled, and half-carried him the 1/4 mile to her cottage, her shoulders burned, and the sky had gone from amber to violet to the flat gray-black of early night. She built the fire first, then she lit the lamp. Then she cut away the ruined cloak and the linen beneath it and got to work. She had saved men before. A woodcutter's son, a shepherd who had been gored, an old hermit who had confused poisonous mushrooms for edible ones. She had not saved them because she was heroic. She had saved them because her hands knew what to do, and it seemed a worse thing not to use them. She did not save this man for any reason she could name. She worked through the night. She cleaned the wound with spirits that would have made a conscious man shout. She packed it with honey-soaked cloth the way her grandmother had taught her. She wrapped it in linen strips, tight and even, and then she sat back on her heels and watched the firelight move across his face. His brow had furrowed somewhere in the middle of her work, as though even in unconsciousness, some part of him found the indignity of the situation disagreeable. She almost smiled. Almost. He woke at dawn, and the first thing he did was try to stand up. Seraphine heard the thud from where she sat at the small table eating porridge, and looked over to find him on the floor beside her sleeping pallet, already attempting to push himself upright. She watched him manage to get his arms beneath him, watched the exact moment he learned what the wound in his shoulder had to say about that plan. Watched his jaw clench so hard she could count the effort. "Stop," she said. Not unkindly, but without room for argument. He went still. His eyes found her across the small room. They were dark, a peculiar shade that sat somewhere between charcoal and storm cloud gray, the kind of color that changed with the light, the way deep water did. In the gold of morning firelight, there were threads of darker brown in them, like iron cooling. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at everything, like a commander assessing a situation, measuring threat and advantage simultaneously. "You moved me," he said. His voice was low, the rasp of it pulled tighter than usual by pain, but even like this, it carried the weight of someone accustomed to being listened to. "You were bleeding in my forest," she replied. It seemed untidy. Something shifted in his expression, not softening precisely, but a fractional easing of whatever held it rigid. "Your forest." "My forest," she confirmed, and went back to her porridge. He was silent for long enough that she thought perhaps he had passed out again. Then, "You removed the arrow." "Yesterday evening." "I did not." He stopped. She heard him recalibrate. "I was not aware of it." That was rather the point. She glanced over her shoulder. He had managed, while she was not watching, to pull himself back up onto the pallet, though the effort had left a new pallor across his face. She rose without comment, poured water into a clay cup, brought it to him. He did not thank her. He did, however, drink. He was looking at the room now, cataloging it, she thought, with those quiet storm-gray eyes. The braided herb bundles hanging from the rafters, the row of clay pots on the shelf, each labeled in her small, precise hand. The single window, oilskin covered, rattling faintly in the morning wind. The lack of any second sleeping pallet. "You live alone," he said, demonstrably. "It is not safe." "It is safer," she said, "than most alternatives I've encountered." She picked up her bowl again. "Eat or don't, but if you try to stand before midday, I will let you fall this time. You'll reopen the wound and be useless for longer." He was quiet. She could feel his gaze on the side of her face, reading her the way she had watched him read the room. "What is your name?" he asked. "Seraphine." She did not ask for his. He told her anyway, and the name landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Ragnar Halvson, High King of the Northern Reaches, Alpha King of 9 clans. The man whose face appeared on the war banners that had twice passed through this forest in the years she'd lived here, distant and magnificent, and entirely untethered from the reality of a man who was currently sitting on her sleeping pallet, looking annoyed about being alive. She looked at him for a moment. "Well," she said, "you're going to need more water." He stayed because he had no choice. A king without a horse, without his guard, with an arrow wound and a broken saddle boot, he was, functionally, her guest, whether either of them found the arrangement comfortable or not. His men would search for him. It might take days. In the meantime, he healed. He was a difficult patient, in the way that powerful men often were, not by complaining, but by refusing to admit limitation. He would sit too long in the draft from the window, and not mention the shiver that started in his good shoulder. He would attempt to lift things with the injured arm and cover the wince with absolute neutrality of expression. She learned, in those first 2 days, to watch not his face, but his hands. The small tightening of the fingers, the slight curl when something cost him more than he was willing to say. She brought him bone broth. She brought him more water. She changed the dressing twice a day. The second time she changed it, on the second evening, the sky outside gone to deep purple and the fire grown low, she nearly went to him with the lamp to see better, and then did not, because something about the quality of the silence in the room made her careful. She knelt beside the pallet. He was sitting up, his broad back turned partly toward her, the injured shoulder presented with the resigned tolerance of a man who had accepted being managed. His shirt was off. This was practical. She had told herself it was practical. She unwound the old linen. The wound was clean. She had not been wrong about the angle of the arrow. It had missed everything vital. But the bruising that had spread around it was deep and extensive, and she ran one thumb along the edge of it without thinking, checking the warmth of the surrounding flesh. He went very still, not in pain. She knew what stillness and pain looked like on him by now. This was different. This was the stillness of a man who had been caught off guard by something he had not catalogued. Her own heart, to her irritation, responded to his stillness by doing something erratic and unhelpful. She focused. She pressed her fingers against the edge of the bruising, methodical, working inward. His skin was warm, warmer than the ambient temperature of the room, the particular warmth of a body burning hard to heal itself. She could smell pine resin and something deeper, something that belonged entirely to him. "Does this hurt?" she asked. "No." The word came out lower than his usual register. She pressed slightly firmer. "And this?" "No." She pressed at the edge of the wound itself. "That," he said, very precisely, "is noticeable." "Good." Sensation returning. She reached for the clean linen. "It means the damage was less than I thought." She began to wrap the new dressing, winding the cloth around his shoulder, over the curve of it, back under his arm. She had to lean closer to manage the angle, and when she did, she became aware of his face in her peripheral vision, turned now to look at whatever was outside the oilskin window. His profile in the firelight looked as though someone had carved it from the same pale granite as the northern cliffs. The jaw was sharp. The temple showed the branching of a shadow where the muscle worked once, then stilled. She tied off the linen and sat back. "You should eat," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of it. He turned then and looked directly at her, and the firelight moved across the gray dark of his eyes. And for a moment, just a moment, she saw something there that was not the king assessing, not the commander calculating. Something that looked, briefly, like a man startled by something he hadn't expected. "Yes," he said, "I should." Neither of them moved for 3 full seconds. Then she rose and went to the pot over the fire, and did not look at him again for the rest of the evening. He was better by the 4th day. Better meant walking to the door and back without pain. Better meant eating everything she gave him and asking for more, which she interpreted as a good sign, even if he asked in the same flat tone he used for everything. Better meant the gray in his eyes had sharpened, from the clouded look of a man in fever to the clean, focused look of a man reassembling himself. He began to be useful. This surprised her. She returned from gathering frostroot one afternoon to find he had split enough wood to last her the better part of a month, the pile of it stacked against the cottage wall with the precision of a man who did not know how to do things carelessly. He was standing with the axe in one hand, looking at the stack, with the same expression she imagined he gave military strategy. Assessing, adjusting, satisfied. She stood in the door and looked at the wood and then at him. "Your shoulder," she said, "is fine." "I didn't ask how it felt. I said your shoulder." He set the axe down against the wall. "The bleeding has stopped. The inflammation is gone. I have not re-injured it." She studied him. She had gotten, without quite deciding to, very good at reading the texture of his silences. This one was telling the truth. "Thank you," she said, and meant it plainly. He looked at her for a moment, with an expression she couldn't categorize, and said nothing. But as she passed him to go inside, he took the basket from her arm, not asked, not announced, simply done, and carried it to the table. She stood in the middle of the small room and felt something warm settle in her chest, the way heat settles into stone. That night, the wind came down from the north with its full winter teeth. The cottage held well enough. But the single fire could not entirely compete with what crept in under the door and through the gaps at the window frame. She had lived through worse. She pulled her heaviest shawl around her shoulders and read by the lamplight and tried not to notice that the cold was accumulating. She noticed that he noticed. He sat on the other side of the fire, the farthest point in the small room, his back against the wall, watching the flames. He had been watching the flames for an hour. She had gotten very aware, in the past 4 days, of what the particular quality of his stillness meant. This was not the stillness of someone thinking. This was the stillness of someone choosing to do nothing. She watched him decide to do something. He reached behind him, where the charcoal wool cloak had been folded. Repaired, she noticed. He had repaired the torn shoulder seam himself while she slept. Small, close stitches in a thread the precise color of the surrounding wool. And he rose and crossed the room and set it around her shoulders without a word. The weight of it settled over her like a small, private thing. It was still warm from being near the fire. It smelled of pine and iron and the cold outside air from when he'd been chopping wood. And underneath all of that, it smelled like him. She did not say, "Thank you." He did not say anything either. He went back to his side of the fire and sat back down against the wall and looked at the flames. Seraphine pulled the cloak a little more closely and also looked at the flames and thought about the distance between opposite walls in a very small room and found it suddenly both vast and not nearly sufficient. His men found him on the 5th day. She heard horses before she saw them, a lot of horses, moving through the birch forest with the particular intention of horses carrying armed men. She stepped to the window and looked out and counted. 12 riders in formation, wearing the gray and black of his house colors, and at their head a man with a warrior's braid, who shouted something that was swallowed by the wind. She turned. Ragnar was already standing. He had, she realized, heard them coming before she had. He was dressed. She had mended his shirt 2 days ago, a task she'd performed with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything, and had not thought about since. Now she looked at him, standing in the full height of himself in the low cottage, and was freshly aware of how much of him the small space had been containing. He seemed to expand slightly, the way a river seems larger once you see how much of it the bank had been holding back. He picked up the repaired cloak from where she'd folded it the night before. Folded it neatly, he'd noticed. She kept everything neat. And put it on. The torn shoulder seam vanished into the sweep of the wool. His back straightened in a way that had nothing to do with posture and everything to do with the kind of authority that lived in the spine. The king was reassembling himself. She watched it happen, and something behind her sternum squeezed. He moved toward the door, then stopped. He turned to look at her. His eyes in the gray daylight coming through the oilskin window were the color of deep winter sky. Not storm dark, but the clear, cold gray of early morning before the clouds built. They held her face for a moment. "You will be compensated," he said. "For the medicine, for the food. I don't need compensation." He stopped. A muscle moved along his jaw. "Nevertheless, you will receive it." She looked back at him. Ragnar. It was the first time she had used his name. Something flickered across his face, so briefly that she might have imagined it. "Thank you," she said, "for the wood." He held her gaze for another moment. His face was its familiar, controlled self, the face of a king, the face of a man who made decisions that affected thousands of people and had learned to do it from behind glass. She had spent 5 days learning to read what lived behind the glass. What lived there now was something that pulled at him. She could see the pull of it. "Seraphine," he said, just her name, nothing after. Then he turned and opened the door and stepped into the gray October morning, and the forest and his men and the whole enormous machinery of his life swallowed him whole. She stood in the open doorway for a long time after the sound of horses had faded into the birch trees, the cold air moving against her face, her hands loose at her sides. The fire behind her popped once and settled. She went back inside. She picked up the bowl he had eaten from that morning and washed it in the water basin. She put the extra blanket away. She restored everything to its usual arrangement. It was only when she sat back down at the table that she noticed he had left the cloak folded on the edge of the pallet, too precisely to be an accident. She did not see him again for 8 weeks. She knew where he was, in the vague way that people who lived near power knew things. The gossip of traders who passed through the forest road, the talk of the village 2 leagues south. Ragnar Halvson had returned to Darkholm, the great fortress of the northern reaches, and resumed the business of being a king. The autumn thing, the treaties, the tribute, the problem of the eastern clans who had started ignoring old agreements. Normal things. King things. Seraphine gathered her herbs and made her medicines, and slept in the bed where he had slept, and did not think about him. This was not entirely true, but it was the version of events she maintained. The world changed around her when the snows came. It was during the first real blizzard of winter that a messenger came to her door. A boy of about 15, red-faced and frozen, wearing the gray and black of Halfson's house. He thrust a letter at her with the dignity of a young man taking his duties very seriously. He also thrust a second thing, a square of heavy oilcloth protecting something. She opened the letter. It said, in handwriting that was precise and angular, and did not waste space on pleasantries, "The medicines I required, the time it cost you, the inconvenience. R.H." She opened the oilcloth. Inside was enough Frankish silver to buy the cottage 3 times over. There was also a small glass jar of rendered bear fat, a fine healer's substance, hard to source in the north, expensive. And at the bottom of the package, tucked without ceremony into the corner, a sachet of dried juniper and pine that smelled, when she lifted it to her face, precisely like. She set the sachet down. "Tell the king thank you," she said to the boy. "Yes, my lady." "I'm not a lady." "Yes, my lady." She shut the door. She went to Darkholm in February because she had been asked. Not by Ragnar, by Gregor Aldrich, the fortress physician. A round, clever man of middle age who had heard of her work, he said, from the king's own description, and wished to trade knowledge. She almost did not go. She packed her medicines and went because it was logical. The trade would be valuable, the knowledge was worth having, and it had nothing to do with wanting to see the look in a pair of dark gray eyes when they found her in an unfamiliar room. Darkholm swallowed her whole. She had lived in a forest cottage for 4 years. She was not prepared for the scale of the place. The walls 10 feet thick, the great hall with its vaulted ceiling strung with 100 candles, the noise and smell and sheer density of human habitation. She followed Gregor through corridors and courtyards and tried to look as though none of it overwhelmed her, which it absolutely did. She saw him at dinner. He was at the high table, as of course he was, and she was at the low end of the hall, among the physicians and the craftspeople and the visiting traders. And the hall was perhaps 40 feet long. She told herself 40 feet was a sufficient and reasonable distance. She told herself that she needed to look at him only once, just to confirm that the general reality of him matched the reconstructed version she had been involuntarily maintaining, and then she would stop. He was speaking to someone to his left. The firelight from the massive central hearth touched him at an angle that was specifically unkind to her composure. The strong line of his shoulder, the way his head tilted very slightly when he was listening, the controlled economy of his gestures. He had shaved. The clean edge of his jaw was harder without the dark growth. He looked up. Across 40 feet of hall, full of noise and firelight and 200 people, his gaze found her with the directness of a compass finding north. She looked away first. Her heart, the traitorous thing, continued with its erratic and unhelpful behavior. She was there for 3 days. On the second day, Gregor showed her the supply rooms and then the cold cellar where the winter medicines were stored, and they traded knowledge for 2 hours in the pleasant, absorbed way of 2 people who loved the same thing. When she emerged back into the corridor, it was already mid-afternoon, and the light through the arrow slits in the eastern wall was the flat, white light of overcast February. Ragnar was in the corridor. He had not been there when she'd gone into the supply room. He was not doing anything specifically. He was standing with his arms crossed, looking at something on the opposite wall. A tapestry, old and faded, of a hunting scene. He looked at it with the same attention he had given the fire in her cottage. Not seeing it, exactly, but present in its vicinity. "You're here," he said. Not a question. "Gregor invited me." She resisted the pull to explain further. It was, she had noticed about herself, an instinct she had when she felt uncertain. To explain. To justify. She refused it. He nodded. He looked at the tapestry again. "Is the trade useful?" "Very." "Good." His jaw worked once. "How is the cottage?" The wood you split lasted until January." She kept her voice even. "I have been managing since." Something crossed his face. "I will send more." "I don't need. You will receive it." The precise echo of their last exchange. A muscle at the corner of his mouth moved, the smallest possible movement. Not quite a smile. Something that acknowledged the echo. She looked at him for a moment. He looked at her. The corridor was empty except for them, and somewhere outside the arrow slit, the wind pushed against the stone walls without getting in. "Ragnar," she said. He waited. She didn't know, actually, what she had meant to say after that. She had meant to say something that was true and clear and not cowardly. Something about the cloak he had left, which she had washed and folded, and still kept on the edge of the pallet, every morning choosing not to send it back, and every morning noting the choice. She said, "You look well." It was not the true and clear thing. It was the cowardly thing. "You also," he said. He looked at her for one more moment, and there it was again. The thing she had seen at her door on the 5th day, that pull behind his eyes, the tension of something held deliberately still. Then he uncrossed his arms and turned and walked away down the corridor. She stood for a long time looking at the hunting tapestry. She was still looking at it when she became aware of footsteps approaching from the other direction, and turned to find a woman coming toward her down the corridor. She was perhaps 25, dressed in the gray and cream of old northern nobility, with pale hair dressed high, and a face that had the particular kind of beauty that was designed to be observed. Symmetrical, composed, aware of itself. The woman stopped and looked at Seraphine with pale blue eyes that were not unfriendly precisely, but were very thorough. "You're the forest healer," she said. "I am." "I am Valdis." She extended the name without title or explanation, in the way of someone who expected recognition. Seraphine recognized it. Every woman in the northern reaches would have recognized it. Valdis Stren, daughter of the Stren clan, one of the oldest and most powerful bloodlines in the north. She had been discussed, in the vague gossip of traders, in the same breath as Ragnar's name for 3 years. "Valdis," Seraphine said. "A pleasure." Valdis looked at her for one more moment with those pale, thorough eyes. "Likewise," she said, and walked on. They held the feast on the 3rd evening of Seraphine's stay. It was, she gathered from Gregor's careful tone when he mentioned it, a significant occasion. The clan representatives had gathered. The treaty season was concluding. It was customary at such moments for the king to mark a political transition with celebration. She wore what she had brought to wear, a dress of dark blue wool, plain and well-made, bought years ago in a market town, and kept for occasions that rarely arose in the forest. She had her hair down. It fell dark and straight to the middle of her back, and she had pinned the front of it back with the 2 silver pins she owned. Gregor fetched her from her guest room with a kind expression that told her he was aware of something she was not. The hall was full when they entered. The fires were high. The noise was layered and warm. The high table gleamed with candles. She found her seat among the physicians and craftspeople and settled herself, and told herself she was attending a feast as a guest, and there was nothing particular about this evening. She had told herself this roughly 40 times in the past hour. The king's table grew quiet when Ragnar rose. He was at the head of it, and standing, he occupied the full height of his frame in a way that rooms seemed to know about instinctively. Voices dropped, attention gathered, without anyone precisely deciding to. He wore the dark charcoal wool of his house colors, with a silver torque at his throat that caught the candlelight. She looked at him through the length of the hall, and he looked precisely nothing like the man who had slept in her bed and drunk water from her clay cup, and split enough firewood for a month with quiet, matter-of-fact consideration. He looked like a king. He raised his cup. The hall rose with him. "In the matter of the Eastern Treaty," he said, and his voice carried without effort, "we conclude this season in agreement and alliance." The cup tilted in the direction of the Eastern clan delegates, who bowed. "And in the matter of union, which the North has long required of this seat." Something in the room changed. Seraphine became aware of it before she understood it, a particular quality of attention, charged and anticipatory. "I will name a queen." She heard his voice say it. She watched him say it. She watched him turn, with the cup still raised, toward the high end of the hall, where Valdis sat, in the gray and cream of old Stren nobility. And she watched Valdis rise, with the composure of a woman who had known this moment was coming. She watched the hall erupt with the sound of approval and celebration. She sat in the noise of it for a moment. The candle in front of her burned with absolute steadiness. She looked at its flame and thought, "Of course." She thought, "This is what kings do. And you knew what he was from the beginning, and you are sitting at the low end of this table because that is exactly where you belong." She thought, "You are a forest healer, and he is an alpha king, and you left nothing behind but a borrowed cloak that you should have sent back weeks ago." She sat through the first round of the feast. She sat through the second round. On the third round, while the toasts were being made and the hall's attention was fully occupied by the theater of celebration, she set her cup down on the table. She folded her napkin. She rose, quietly, and walked to the hall's side door, and went through it, and let the noise diminish behind her. She found Gregor in the corridor outside the supply room at the late hour, and told him she needed to leave early. "A patient," she said, "back in the village." She said it smoothly. She almost believed it herself. He looked at her with his round, clever eyes. He said nothing that indicated he understood. He simply said that her contributions to his knowledge had been invaluable, and that the supplies he had sent to her room would serve her well, and that she was welcome at Darkholm at any time. "Thank you, Gregor," she said. She went to her room and packed her bag. She slept. Before the gray light of early dawn had fully filled the sky, she settled her bill with the stable boy, took her horse from the warmth of the Darkholm stables, and rode out through the fortress gates. The cold hit her face like a flat hand. The road south into the birch forest was empty and pale under a sky that hadn't quite decided whether to show sun or keep everything gray. She rode at a steady pace and did not look back. She thought, "This is the correct thing." She thought, "There is nothing to stay for, and there never was." She thought, "You have your medicines and your forest and your work, and these have always been enough." She counted the birch trees as they passed. She focused on the warmth of the horse beneath her. She was completely, entirely fine. The silver jar of bear fat was in her bag. The juniper sachet was there too. She had not, she noticed, left behind the cloak. The cottage was exactly as she had left it. She hung her cloak. She built the fire. She heated water and made tea, and sat at the table in the gathering dusk, and felt the silence of the place settle around her like something earned. This was her life. These were the correct dimensions of it. She drank her tea. She went to bed. She woke in the night and lay in the dark and thought about the way firelight had looked in a pair of dark gray eyes, and the way warmth still lived in a folded piece of charcoal wool, and was furious with herself about both of these things. Morning came, as mornings do, with the particular indifference of light to human difficulty. She did what she always did. She gathered, she prepared, she worked. A woman from the village came for a remedy for her son's cough. A shepherd passed with a cut on his forearm that needed cleaning. She was useful. She was efficient. She was fine. A week passed. Then 2. She stopped expecting to hear horses in the forest. She stopped looking at the door. She was fine. She heard them on a Tuesday morning. Not many horses this time. 2, perhaps 3, moving through the birch forest at a pace that spoke of purpose rather than patrol. She was at the window before she'd made a conscious decision to move, the yarrow she'd been sorting forgotten in her hands. The first horse through the trees was a dark gray gelding she didn't recognize. The second was a large black stallion she did. She stepped back from the window. She sat back down at the table. She picked up the yarrow and continued sorting it with complete concentration, which is why she didn't notice her hands had stopped moving until a knock came at the door. She stared at the door. The knock came again, firm even, not impatient. It had patience built into it, in a way that was worse than impatience. She set down the yarrow. She stood. She crossed to the door and opened it. He was standing close. Her door was not wide, the step not deep, which meant that when she opened it, she found him at a proximity she hadn't prepared for, close enough to see the individual snowflakes that had caught, and not yet melted, on the shoulders of his cloak. His face was cold reddened across the cheekbones, in the way of a man who had been riding in winter air. His eyes were dark gray in the flat white light of the overcast sky. She looked at him. He looked at her. "You left," he said. She kept her voice steady. "I had a patient." "No, you didn't." A beat of silence. The wind moved through the birch trees. "Ragnar," she said, "you announced your queen to the entire North 3 days ago." "I know what I announced." "Then why are you here?" His jaw was set. She recognized the expression. She'd had 4 days to learn it, weeks ago. The face of a man who had made a decision and was now executing it with the same precision he gave everything, regardless of the difficulty. "Because I made a mistake," he said. The words came out as though they had cost him something real. She gripped the doorframe. "You named Valdis Stren before 200 people and 6 clan representatives." "I know." He looked at her, and the dark gray of his eyes had gone very still, the way deep water goes still before something rises from it. "I was trying to do what kings do. I was trying to do what was expected and appropriate and politically sound." His voice didn't rise, but the precision of it shifted, like a blade turned edge on. "I was trying not to want what I wanted." The cold air moved between them. "What did you want?" she asked. The words came out barely above a whisper, and she resented them for it. He said, "You know what I wanted." She looked at him for a long moment. The yarrow smell was on her hands, and the fire behind her was sending a thread of warmth through the open door into the cold. And the birch trees stood white and patient all around them, and somewhere overhead, a single thrush was making its winter sound. "Your cloak is inside," she said. "I kept it." Something moved through his face, not the controlled shift she had learned to catalog, but something larger and less managed, something that showed the actual shape of what was underneath. "Seraphine," he said. "You still announced Valdis," she said. "Before everyone. You can't unmake that." "I can." He said it quietly and absolutely, in the tone of a man who had already worked out what it would cost and had decided to pay it. The announcement was political, not sacred. Valdis knew. She is practical. She understands political necessity, and something crossed his face. "She told me, last night, that I was a fool." Seraphine blinked. "Did she?" "She said I had been looking at one end of that hall all evening, and she found it rather insulting." His mouth moved. It was, she thought, the closest thing to rueful she had ever seen on him. "She is not wrong to find it insulting. I owe her a significant apology." "You owe her." Seraphine stopped. Something almost like a laugh was building in her chest, inappropriate and unstoppable. You rode through a February blizzard to tell me that the woman you named your queen called you a fool? I rode through a February blizzard, he said precisely, because you left before I had the chance to. He stopped. He looked at her. The controlled stillness she knew so well was present. But underneath it, close to the surface in a way it hadn't been before, was the pull she had seen at her door the first time, in the corridor at Darkholm. Every time he had been in this space with her, and said things that stopped just short of what they meant. "To what?" she said. "To tell you," he said, "that I have not slept well since I left this cottage. That when I look at my hall, I see the wrong proportions. That when I walk the corridors of a fortress that has housed my family for 6 generations, it is too large in the wrong way. That when Valdis spoke to me at that table last night, I was not thinking about Valdis." He looked at her, and the dark gray of his eyes had gone the color they sometimes went in firelight, when the brown threads in them surfaced and made the whole shade warmer. "And that you took my cloak." She looked up at him. "I kept it," she said again. "I know." She stepped back from the door. He came in. The fire was still lit. He didn't sit where she'd expected, on the pallet, which was the obvious seat, but stood in the center of the room, and the room received him with the same proportional competence it had managed the first time. Just barely enough. He took up space the way he always had, not aggressively, but as a simple fact of his dimensions. And the cottage was the same cottage it had always been, and something about the combination of these two constants felt like a truth she had been storing up for months without knowing where to put it. She did not offer him tea. She stood with her back against the table and looked at him, and he looked at her, and the fire between them made one of its slow sounds. "You never said anything," she said. "In all that time. You were here 5 days and you never—" "No." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Not avoiding the question, she'd learned the difference between his silences. This was the silence of a man choosing the exact right words, which was how he did everything. "Because you lived here alone, by choice," he said. "Because you fed me bone broth and told me to stop trying to stand up. And there was nothing in any of it that asked for anything from me." Something shifted in his face. "Because I have walked into rooms full of women who wanted something from me since I was 15 years old. And you gave me 3 days of clean water and clean bandaging, and then told me to leave." She blinked. "I didn't tell you to. You didn't ask me to stay." The silence after that was the kind that filled itself in. She said, "I didn't think you would." "I know." He looked at her steadily. "That was also why." She thought about this. She thought about the cloak on the pallet, the wood stacked against the wall, the silver and the juniper sachet, the way she had felt his eyes find her across 40 feet of firelit hall, the way a compass finds north. "You're a king," she said. "Yes. I'm a forest healer. I'm aware. That doesn't work." He crossed the room. Not fast, not rushed, not dramatic. He crossed it the way he did everything, with decision, and with the quiet certainty of a man who had already determined the path and was simply following it. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head to hold his gaze, close enough that the warmth of him was entirely distinct from the warmth of the fire. His hand came up, and with a care that was completely at odds with the apparent hardness of everything else about him, tucked a strand of her dark hair back from her face. His fingers grazed her jaw. Her heart did the thing it had been doing for months, the erratic and unhelpful thing, but louder this time. Louder than the fire and the wind outside, and the sound of 2 horses in the yard. "Seraphine," he said. Very quiet, very certain. She looked up at him. "I told them I was wrong," he said. "I told the council. I told Valdis. I told them what I wanted and why. I am—" The muscle in his jaw moved. I am not accustomed to being wrong. I am less accustomed to admitting it. I noticed. I am also, he said, with a precise care that she understood was the closest thing he had to eloquence when it came to this, not accustomed to wanting something I do not know how to have. She said, You could ask for it. He looked at her for a long moment. His thumb traced once the line of her cheekbone. Stay at Darkholm, he said. Come back with me. Gregor wants your knowledge, and I want... His voice stopped. His eyes were dark and very still and very direct. Come back with me. She should, perhaps, have made him wait. She should, perhaps, have been more cautious, or more strategic, or less affected by the warmth of a hand that had split her firewood, and sent her bare fat, and ridden through February with snowflakes on its shoulders. She wasn't. She had been 4 things in her life: brave, practical, honest, and occasionally a fool, and she could live with all 4 of them. I'll need to bring my medicines, she said. The thing that moved across his face then was not the almost smile she had catalogued before. It was the actual thing, brief and private and entirely unguarded, and it transformed the carved granite architecture of his face into something that made her understand, fully, why a room full of women had been wanting something from him since he was 15. He put both hands on her face. He looked at her. Then he bent his head and kissed her. And outside in the birch forest, the thrush was still singing, and the fire was still warm, and the snow had started to fall again in soft, unhurried flakes. The road back to Darkholm took 2 days in good weather. In February, it took 3. He did not tell her this was a problem. He did not tell her this at all, which was how she discovered that the man who had split a month of firewood while injured and repaired his own cloak with small close stitches apparently had a talent for making accommodation appear without announcement. The first night there was a way-station inn where a room had already been arranged, warm, with a fire and a good supper, and she only realized it had been arranged specifically when she saw the look the innkeeper gave his master, with the expression of a man who had ridden ahead very fast 2 hours ago. She raised an eyebrow at Ragnar. He was entirely absorbed in his wine. She let it go. The second night, a snowstorm came down on them properly, and they sheltered in a shepherd's barn that smelled of straw and animal warmth, the horses tied in the lower stalls, a bedroll he produced from somewhere, spread on the clean upper straw. He sat with his back against the barn wall, in the particular posture of a man prepared to be very comfortable on a wooden floor for as long as necessary, and offered her the bedroll, with the same practicality with which he offered everything. You take it, she said. You're colder. I'm not. She stopped, because she absolutely was, and he could tell, because he could tell everything. And this was apparently a quality of his that she was going to have to accept. She took the bedroll. He sat against the wall. She settled into the straw. The lamplight from the small lantern they'd brought moved across the low ceiling of the barn in slow, amber shapes. Outside, the wind drove snow against the barn walls in sweeping rushes. Ask me something, she said. He looked over at her. In the low light, the dark brown threads in his eyes were dominant. They looked almost warm. About what? Anything. Something I wouldn't expect. She pulled the bedroll up to her chin. You know half of my life from the first 5 days, and you've given me almost nothing in return. A long pause. The barn creaked. What made you go to the forest? He said. The cottage. 4 years alone. What made you go? She had expected something about her work, about medicines, something practical. She looked at the amber shapes on the ceiling. I had been someone's daughter, she said, and then someone's apprentice, and then someone's... She stopped. I had always been in relation to someone else. The forest was the first place I was just myself. He was quiet. What made you come back from the forest? She said. A pause. Then, very quietly, you were already gone. She turned her head to look at him. He was looking at the lantern, his profile sharp and still against the barn wall, and there was nothing in his expression that was performing anything for her benefit. He said it the way he said everything true. Plainly, precisely, as though truth was simply the most efficient substance. She said nothing. She turned back to the ceiling. After a while, she said, "Ragnar." "Yes?" "Come here." A pause. Then the sound of him rising, crossing the small space, settling into the straw beside her. Close, not touching, but close. The warmth of him distinct against the cold of the barn. She pulled the edge of the bedroll open. An offer. He lay down beside her, and the warmth doubled, and outside the storm pushed against the walls and found no way in. She was aware of every point where the length of him almost touched her. She was aware of the particular quality of his breathing, slow and controlled, the breathing of a man who is being very careful not to be careless. She turned her head. His face was inches from hers. "You're trying very hard not to do anything," she said. "Yes," he said. "Stop trying so hard." His hand found hers in the dark. They lay like that while the storm went on outside, their fingers tangled together in the warmth of the bedroll, and she felt the tension in him slowly, incrementally release. Not gone, but settled, the way a sword settles back into a sheath, and thought about what it must cost a man like that to lay down all that control in a shepherd's barn, with the wind outside, and felt, in the answering loosening of something in her own chest, precisely what kind of thing she had let herself want. Darkholm received them on the third afternoon, the gates opening before they reached them. She rode in beside him, not behind him, not at a careful distance, beside him. The yard was full of the ordinary business of a fortress: grooms, guardsmen, servants crossing the cobblestones on their way from one place to another. People looked up. The looking was brief and particular, and she did not need to be a political expert to understand what it meant. She kept her chin level and her eyes forward, and thought about yarrow and bear fat and the practical utility of simply being in the place she was. Gregor met them at the stable door with a face that was doing its best to conceal profound satisfaction, and not entirely succeeding. "Seraphine," he said warmly, "I hoped you might return." "I imagine you did," she said, and got down from her horse and let a groom take it, and followed Ragnar across the cobblestones into the warmth of the fortress. The first evening, she asked about her room. He showed it to her himself. A good room, high in the eastern tower, with a window that looked out over the forest and a fireplace that drew well. It had a work table that she could see was new, the wood lighter than the rest of the furniture, with shelves already built along one wall, empty and waiting. She ran her hand along the edge of the nearest shelf. "You planned this room," she said. "It was planned," he agreed, which was not the same thing as answering the question, and they both knew it. And he looked at her sideways with the trace of that almost expression. "Before the feast," she said. He looked at the window. She looked at the side of his face, and thought about a man who said nothing about what he wanted, but built it a room, and stocked it with shelves, and arranged a warm inn on the first night of a winter journey, and split a month of firewood while healing from an arrow wound, and rode through February to say, "I was wrong, and you took my cloak." "Ragnar," she said. He looked at her. She crossed the room and took hold of the front of his cloak, the charcoal wool, the one she had kept, the one he had put around her shoulders in the cold, and she pulled him down the few inches of height difference, and kissed him with the complete, deliberate honesty she brought to everything. He made a sound low in his throat. His hands found her waist and pulled decisively, and kissed her back with the same decisive quality he gave everything, not rushed, but certain, like a man who had decided and was not reconsidering. When she pulled back, he was looking at her with the thing she had been cataloging for months. The pull behind his eyes, the thing underneath the glass, fully surfaced, finally, out in the open air. "I brought my medicines," she said. "I see that. I am still a healer. I know what you are." "And you are still—" "Yes," he said. "I am still all of those things." His thumbs pressed into her waist, warm and deliberate. "I am also the man who cannot sleep when the room has the wrong proportions." He looked at her. "I intend to be both." She thought about this. Outside the eastern window, the forest she had ridden out of 3 days ago was a dark line against the snow-pale sky, the birch trees small and white in the distance. "The shelves need filling," she said. He looked at the empty shelves along the wall, then back at her, and this time, the almost smile was not almost anything. It was the actual thing, warm and private and unguarded. The expression she had first seen in the cold of a shepherd's barn, over tangled hands. And it did to her what it did every time. Remade the entire geography of his face. "Then fill them," he said. She did. Not in a day or a week, but in the particular incremental way that real things fill up. A jar of rendered fat, a bundle of yarrow, a pot of wintergreen salve. A stack of Gregor's books, trading space with her own. The juniper sachet hung above the window because it kept the insects away in spring, and because it smelled like pine and iron and the cold morning outside a barn where the wind couldn't get in. The fortress learned about her the way fortresses learn things. Gradually, then completely. The kitchen learned to keep bone broth simmering because someone made use of it, and made use of it at hours that told you someone had been working. The stable boys learned that the healer's horse was to be brushed first, regardless of the order of arrival. The great hall learned, over many dinners, that the woman at the high table to the left of the king did not particularly want to be talked to before her first cup of warm cider. The council learned not to send messages asking for the king during the evening hours, after a specific occasion on which someone had apparently been extremely unimpressed with the interruption. Ragnar gave her nothing. He did not gift her jewelry, or commission her portrait, or compose verses about her hair. He did not call her beautiful in front of the court, or announce things in her honor, or perform tenderness for any audience. What he did? He made sure the fire in her room was lit before she returned from evening rounds. He learned, without being told, the particular herbal tea she made in the small hours when she couldn't sleep, and twice she woke to find it already made and still warm. On the morning she spent 3 hours in the cold, treating a cluster of workers with winter fever, and came back chilled through, he appeared in her workroom with a bowl of broth and a blanket, and the expression of a man doing something practical, and sat with her while she ate. She told him once that he didn't have to do that. He looked at her with the storm-gray eyes that had gone very gold at the edges. She had noticed this in recent months. The way the gray warmed to amber when it was just them, in the low light, in the real hours, and said, "I know." She looked at him. He looked at her. "I want to," he said. As though it were that simple. As though wanting things was simply the most honest substance, and the thing to do with honesty was to say it plainly, once, and then act on it without fuss. She reached across the workroom table and covered his hand with hers. Outside the window, the spring had been coming in small increments for weeks. A degree of warmth in the air, a loosening of the frost on the window glass, the first pale green suggestions of buds on the birch trees. The world was doing what it always did, unhurried and complete, the way real things developed. Not in a day or a week, but in all the small accumulations that you only understand have happened when you sit back and look at what has filled the shelves. She looked at the shelves. She looked at the man across the table, who was looking at her with warm gold-gray eyes, in a face that was carved from northern granite and was not designed, by any outward measure, for the expression it was currently wearing. Open, certain, unhurried, his thumb moving in a small, unconscious arc across the back of her hand. She thought about the forest, about the correct dimensions of a life, about the distance from a cottage to a fortress, and how it could be both very large and entirely irrelevant. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. Outside, the birch trees were coming into leaf. Some people leave without a single word of complaint, not because they feel nothing, but because they have learned that dignity is the only thing no one can take from you. Seraphine never asked him to choose her. She never made a scene, never demanded an explanation, never let anyone in that hall see the moment something inside her went quiet. She simply folded her hands, set down her cup, and walked out before anyone could watch her break. And maybe that is the hardest kind of love to recognize, the kind that takes up no space, asks for nothing, and disappears so cleanly that you only understand what it was once the room feels wrong without it. Ragnar was a king who could command armies and silence halls with a glance. But it took losing one woman who never once raised her voice to teach him the thing no battle ever had. That the bravest thing a person can do is not conquest. It is choosing someone, fully, out loud, at the cost of everything that was easier. Not every love story begins with a grand declaration. Some begin with a cloak left behind on purpose. Some begin with a man who finally rides through the snow, not because he has to, but because the alternative is a life that fits perfectly and means nothing. If this story stayed with you even a little, drop a comment below and tell me, were you rooting for her to forgive him, or did she deserve better? I genuinely want to know what you think. And if you want more stories like this one, a like and subscribe means more than you know. It is what keeps this channel alive and keeps the stories coming. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. It means everything.